The year is 1959. This is Nikita Khruschev, then leader of the Soviet Union. And this is Richard Nixon, then Vice President of the United States of America. And during a conversation between the two people, Khrushchev makes a promise to Nixon: "We will catch up and surpass the United States. We have funds at our disposal that will have dire consequences for you. We will show you Kuzka's mother." The translator was of course confused by the last statement, as was everyone else. It was literally translated as the Soviet Union promising to show the Mother of Kuzka to the United States. What showing Kuzka's mother actually means is basically to teach a lesson harshly. To the Americans, it became a euphemism for atomic bombs. And 2 years later, it would become a direct nickname for a certain nuclear weapon in particular, the largest bomb ever created. Today, this weapon has acquired a very different nickname: the Tsar Bomba. When Khrushchev made those statements to Nixon, he knew that they were not winning the nuclear arms race. The Soviets were 3 years behind the United States in detonating a thermonuclear bomb, and the yield of their weapons was generally smaller than that of the American arsenal. To make the situation even worse for the Soviets, it was a lot harder for them to effectively strike the USA, compared to the Americans having a much faster strike time at the USSR's heartlands by launching from Europe. So, how do you convince a superior side that you are in fact winning the arms race? Quite easy really. Make very big bombs. Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear detonation by the USA, was 15 megatons. Absolutely huge, more than 1,000 times the size of the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima at the end of 1945. But the Soviets knew that it was possible to make a bomb even bigger. 1 year after the detonation of Castle Bravo, in November of 1955, the Soviet Politburo was convinced by a KGB general named Avremy Zhevnyagin, the minister of the nuclear program, for the need to make bigger bombs. They agreed to construct their own superweapon, a 100 megaton thermonuclear device. 4 months later, they agreed on a testing program for their new weapon as well. They already knew who was going to build it as well: the people who had just made the first thermonuclear bomb. Leading them is Andrei Sakharov, who designed the layout of the precursor to the thermonuclear bomb, and RDS-37, the USSR's first two-stage hydrogen bomb. A two-stage hydrogen bomb works, of course, with 2 stages, and the Soviet design is slightly different to American hydrogen bombs. Both begin with the first stage, the initial fission that kickstarts the release of energy. Soviet bombs then use the energy of the radiation released, the X-rays, to compress a secondary structure, which contained lithium deuteride. Neutrons produced by the fission device convert the lithium into helium and tritium, which then fuses with the deuterium in lithium deuteride to form helium, and also releases a gigantic amount of energy. Neutrons are also produced in this fusion, which can then be used to trigger nuclear fission in an equally gigantic amount of an element that normally isn't fissile, like uranium-238, which generally accounts for half of the explosive yield. Sakharov had also worked with Igor Kurchatov at the time, the father of Soviet atomic weapons, but Kurchatov had been exposed to a large dose of radiation in 1949, which led to a stroke in 1954. Sakharov was on his own, and so began Project 202. Attempt number 1 of making a giant thermonuclear weapon based on RDS-37. Preliminary calculations had shown that it would be easy to scale this up to 150 megatons, or perhaps even an entire gigaton, at least theoretically. All they had to do was scale up the materials in the bomb and detonate it. Except, as always, these theoretical calculations are a lot easier to state than actually building the bomb. The estimated size of the bomb was crazy: 10 meters long and 4 meters in diameter, weighing approximately 100 tons. So, they scaled it down to just 30 megatons, making a bomb 8 meters by 2 meters, and weighing just 26 tons, and began to build the device, based on a scaled-up version again of RDS-37. Immediately, they realised they were going to have to change the design a bit. Instead of one fission stage, they used 2 at each end of the bomb, to increase the size of the fusion stage in the centre. The massive bomb could not be stored in a normal bomb casing. A special one had to be designed, so massive that new manufacturing techniques were created just to assemble it. They even began preparing to militarise the bomb, planning the development of a small number of cruise missiles that could launch the device over major cities and industrial areas. And by late 1956, the bomb was ready to be detonated, and Sakharov signed off on it. There was just one problem: the fallout. The Soviets could not predict the weather at the site, and if you can't predict the weather, how can you tell if it would be safe to detonate a bomb that might contaminate large swathes of land? In fact, the few calculations they had for the test site indicated at the largest the safe test they could conduct was 600 kilotons, or 50 times smaller than the bomb they made. The test was postponed until they could determine it was safe. And then, on December 31st, the man whose idea it was to create the bomb, Zvenyagin, died. 3 months later, the experiment was called off, and in 1958, Project 202 was disassembled, the fission and fusion cores removed. At the end of the year, the USSR and USA signed the Voluntary Test Ban Moratorium, ending weapons testing for the time being. Only the incredible case of the project remained, collecting dust, and never to be used, for 3 years. The Cold War was fought on ideological lines, between personalities. In January of 1961, John F. Kennedy became President of the United States of America, and Khrushchev saw a chance to supersede whom he perceived to be a weak rival, by resurrecting the giant thermonuclear bomb project. In July, he called in the scientists, including Sakharov again. Now, Sakharov was beginning to become very disillusioned with all the giant bombs, and when he spoke up against the plans, Khrushchev snapped back at him. They were really doing it this time. When asked for a number, someone suggested 100 megatons, and Khrushchev latched onto it. Let the 100 megaton bomb hang over the capitalists like the sword of Damocles. The Project 202 casing was removed from storage, and again they began to assemble the new bomb, Project 602, inside the casing. The design remained similar, with fission sources at the front and back of the bomb to trigger the central fusion device. But with 5 years of advancement, they could boost the size of the explosion beyond what they could have imagined 5 years ago. Each of the fission devices at the front and back of the bomb was 750 kilotons each. Both are larger than the largest fission bomb ever detonated, the British Orange Herald, and even that was not even purely fission, as the yield was boosted by the same lithium deuteride in the core of Project 602. The thermonuclear stage of Project 602 was about 50 megatons alone. Surrounding the thermonuclear stage was supposed to be another 50 megatons worth of uranium-238, which would fission using the fast neutrons produced by the fusion. The problem with the bomb was now how big it had become. Far, far too big, and far too dangerous to be detonated. The final stage, the uranium-238, would contaminate a large area of soil, as well as of course launch fallout into the atmosphere, carrying it by the wind over populated areas. The Soviet government refused to test the bomb, and Sakharov intervened, replacing the fissile U-238 with inert lead. The next problem was dropping the bomb. Not only was the bomb big explosively, but big literally. It couldn't be launched by cruise missile, they didn't have anything big enough to propel it. So instead it had to be delivered by aircraft. The chances of survival of the crew was estimated at 50-50, but they were never told. The Cold War was heating up again. On August 30th, Nikita Khruschev announced formally that the USSR was walking away from the test ban, triggering a response from Kennedy so severe it was never published. It also hinted at the capability of launching a 100 megaton bomb, which triggered a panic in the American population. Some scientists even jumped onto the train of speculation, hinting the USA also had 100 megaton bombs, but the American government was too concerned trying to stop the Soviets from detonating it. This was immediately countered by Khrushchev when John McCloy, the director of the US Disarmament Commission, was told that they had to test the 100 megaton device to see if it worked. Not even a resolution by the United Nations appealing to them not to detonate Project 602 would stop them. The day after the Soviets walked away from the moratorium, they began a new series of nuclear tests. The first bomb, named simply Test 84, size 16 kilotons. 10th of September, the bomb named Test 90 was dropped over the northern island of Novaya Zemlya. Yield 2.7 megatons. 4th of October, Test 113 is dropped over Novaya Zemlya, 3 megatons. 2 days later, Test 114 is detonated at a yield of 4 megatons. The 17th of October, Khrushchev is delivering a speech at the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party, and breaks away from the scripted speech. He saw an opportunity to comment on Project 602, announcing that by the end of the month it would have been detonated, to thunderous applause from the audience. He even bluffed they had a second one that would actually reach 100 megatons. 23rd of October, Test 123 explodes over Novaya Zemlya with a yield of 12.5 megatons. More than Ivy Mike, the first American thermonuclear device, and almost as much as Castle Bravo. 1 week later, to the protest of the world, Project 602 was readied for detonation. The Tupolev Tu-95V bomber used that day was always intended to drop the Project 202. In 1956, the plane even did a drop of a mock-up version of the bomb, successfully. To make the plane light enough to take off, the external fuel tanks of the plane had been removed, with a new suspension inside used to support the bomb. But after 1959, the plane had been more or less forgotten, delisted as even a military aircraft while being used to train pilots in the Ukrainian SSR. In 1961, the plane was urgently requisitioned for upgrades, removing the bomb bay doors as the bomb was now taller than the mock-up used for testing. It was also painted in a reflective white paint, specifically designed to reflect the thermal energy of the bomb, saving the occupants from the heat. Piloting the aircraft was Major Andrei Donovtsev, a 38-year-old veteran of World War II, assisted by Captain Mikhail Kondratenko. At 8:57 am, the plane took off from the Alenia airfield on the Kola Peninsula. Following behind was a Tupolev Tu-16A laboratory aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Martinenko. The two planes flew northeast, over the Barents Sea, towards the North Island of Novaya Zemlya. At 11:30 am, the planes were 10.5 kilometers over the target, and the bomb was released from the aircraft. The main parachute activated, specially designed to maximize the slow descent of the weapon. 5 more also activated, creating a total surface area of 1,600 square meters, weighing 800 kilograms total. The carrier and laboratory aircrafts kept flying onwards at maximum speed, activating their afterburners to escape the oncoming blast. The crews put on their safety goggles to protect their eyesight from the flash, and the laboratory aircraft pulled ahead of the slower and heavier Tu-95V, which had only been given a 50% chance of escaping the blast wave alive. Barometric sensors in the bomb would detect when it was at 4,200 meters above sea level, initiating the fission implosion device. Only then would they know if their bomb worked. From the airbase, Sakharov and the other scientists waited for news of the detonation, counting down at the base. Sakharov, like Oppenheimer once had before him, had grown completely disillusioned with thermonuclear weapons, having first-hand experience with their power. His calculations had shown that for every megaton of yield a thermonuclear bomb had, 10,000 people would die in the next 8,000 years from the produced radioactive carbon, something he could not tolerate. But, he realised, he had rolled over as part of the Soviet military-industrial complex and produced the largest bomb ever designed. On the opposite side of the Earth, the American government had spent weeks trying to downplay the test. One congressman even announced the existence of the Mark 41 thermonuclear device, an aircraft-dropped bomb capable of 25 megatons, 2 of which could be carried by an aircraft, the same as the 50 megaton bomb the Russians were dropping. No full-scale tests of Mark 41 were ever conducted, although some smaller-scale ones were, like Red Wing's Zuni and Tiwa. These bombs were all retired in 1976, replaced with the B-53, with a maximum yield of 9 megatons. These have all since been retired as well. Cameras on the ground in protected bunkers 20 kilometers away were fixed on the target zone, recording and waiting. The land chosen was uninhabited, a frozen, barren landscape coated in a thick layer of snow, untouched by previous nuclear detonations on the island. There was concern among the scientists involved that the radiation release would make the site too dangerous to approach for the crew that would arrive on the site after the smoke had cleared to research the site. In a few seconds, their fears would either be realised or avoided. At 11:33:31, the bomb finally reached 4,200 meters above sea level. The 2 fission cores worked as intended. These triggered the second stage of the device, the thermonuclear stage. The combined explosive yield of the fission and fusion devices was 58.6 megatons of TNT equivalent. The fireball, 8 kilometers wide, would have hit the ground, but the shockwave of the bomb reflected off the surface of the Earth and struck the fireball, pushing it back up. The fireball peaked at 10.5 kilometers above the ground, the same height as the fleeing aircraft, and was so hot a person could receive a third-degree burn from 100 kilometers away. The flash produced by the fireball was so bright and extended so far above the horizon that it was visible from more than 1,000 kilometers away, as far away as Greenland and Alaska. The sign that alerted most people to the bomb was the shockwave that travelled through the air and the ground, shattering windows as far away as Finland. The sound of the explosion was heard as far as 800 kilometers away, whereas the shockwave circled the globe 3 times over the next 3 days, and was registered as a magnitude 5 earthquake. 35 kilometers away, the village of Severny was completely destroyed. In oblasts around the Russian SSR, wooden and stone houses were damaged by the strength of the blast. The scientists at the airbase knew it had worked when the radio signals from the site were interrupted, as radiation distorted all their frequencies for the next 40 minutes. And towering above everything, even the aircraft, was the mushroom cloud, climbing rapidly, reaching 30 kilometers above the ground in 40 seconds. The mushroom cloud finally peaked at an altitude of 60 kilometers above the ground, and a diameter of 90 kilometers. Losing its momentum, the cloud began to take on unusual shapes, including a sphere and a disorganized mushroom-like shape. Finally, it broke apart into a 2-headed cloud, the upper one having a width of 95 kilometers, and the lower one having a width of 70. This cloud was seen 800 kilometers away. The actual yield of the bomb was some 17% larger than estimated, and unleashed a much larger air blast than the 2 Tupolevs were prepared for. The Tu-95V was 115 kilometers away when the shockwave hit, losing a kilometer of altitude, but was able to safely navigate its way back to base. The Tu-16A was hit by the air blast more than 205 kilometers away from the site. As the pilot Martinenko later described, the aircraft was accelerated from 880 to 980 kilometers per hour, and then entered an area of very low pressure behind the air blast, causing the plane to drop 800 meters before it could resume flight. When they returned to the base, they found that the reflective paint had been seared off of the bottom of the plane, leaving it burned black, and the fuselage was torn open in places, exposing wires in the frame of the craft. The Tupolev was sent to a training centre as a visual lesson on the effect of nuclear bombs on aircraft. Martinenko was unhappy with the event, and after delivering his report, found the scientists and chastised them, calling them scoundrels for underestimating the yield of the bomb. For their efforts, the pilots of the 2 aircrafts were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union for their bravery and actions. The scientists, including Sakharov, were also awarded, but the third title, Hero of Socialist Labour, failed to quell Sakharov's conscience, and he gradually began to move away from thermonuclear bombs and towards human rights activism. When the surveyors arrived at Ground Zero, they found a site unrecognisable. The ground had been vaporised and melted in the explosion, forming a glass-like structure when it cooled, turning the site into something that was visually comparable to an ice skating rink. Nothing else remained. The Tsar Bomba remains the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated. Many assume that Castle Bravo is the second largest. It is not. It is the 6th largest. In the last 5 months of 1962, the USSR would return to Novaya Zemlya 4 more times, with 3 20-megaton nuclear devices. On December 24th, they detonated Test 219, using a cruise missile with a yield of just under 25 megatons. Test 219 was a scaled-down version of a 50 megaton device, a Tsar Bomba deliverable by missile. No photos or videos of this test have been publicly released. The detonation of this bomb drove anti-weapons protests to new heights, and some of the criticism came from within the circles of scientists. Sakharov led the charge, pressuring the government to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963. He denounced the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, founded the Moscow Committee for Human Rights, and became a victim of attacks by the press for his stances. In 1975, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but he was not allowed to leave the country to claim it. At the end of December 1979, he criticised the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and less than a month later, he was detained and exiled to the city of Gorky, stripped of his awards, and was demonised by the press and fellow scientists alike for his human rights stances. Gorbachev allowed him to return to Moscow 6 years later, and he was elected People's Deputy of the USSR, where he continued his human rights activism. He died of a heart attack during the Second Congress of the People's Deputies of the USSR. Some have claimed this was murder. No country has ever attempted to make a weapon as large or larger than the Tsar Bomba, the scaled-back version of the proposed 100 megaton version. Such designs are considered impractical and pointless, but it did successfully complete Khrushchev's goal, to permanently cement the USSR as a powerful nation that could annihilate its enemies if they attempted to attack. According to Sakharov's calculations, roughly 3,875 people have died from illnesses caused by radioactive carbon produced by the Tsar Bomba.